Hey guys, I'm ready to do a valve adjustment on my buggy engine, and figured I'd walk you guys through how to do it. It's a lot easier to see on an open engine like this, so whether it's a buggy or a road car, I think this video will be helpful. So I've got the engine already set at cylinder number 1 top dead center, and if you don't know how to do this, I recently made a video on it. But basically I have aligned the marks on this pulley, and the pulleys are sometimes a little different. But if you get the marks close to the center line of the case and check, your distributor rotor is pointed at cylinder number 1, which in this case I've got a little cheat mark here from Bosch that they included. If you don't have that mark, you can just take the cap, follow which one went to cylinder number 1, and make a mark yourself. But there's a much more detailed video on that. I've double checked to make sure that I'm ready by finding that cylinder number 1, both valves are closed, which means that there is no tension on either of the adjusters. So let's get started. You want a decent quality screwdriver. I've got an older Craftsman screwdriver here because you don't want to bung up the adjusters. This one's already been damaged. This is an old engine that I did the top end on a few years ago, and I just used the stuff, the rocker assembly and all that from the core, and it was bunged up at the time, and I just left it like that. But you don't want to do any more damage to what might already be there. Use a good quality. This is a Mac tool, USA made, 13mm wrench. Same reason, you don't want to damage the nuts, and have a feeler gauge. And we're going to set this to 6/1000ths of an inch. Whenever you're doing work on your Volkswagen, make sure you go by the Bentley manual, not some of the other so-called guides that are out there. Use the official service manual. And this came off a 1600 single port car from 1971, and I know that all engines are recommended by this Bentley manual to be set at 6/1000ths of an inch. If you have an older car, this service manual says the same thing, 6/1000ths of an inch. Now, we know that these cars have been highly modified. I mean, in this case, we're working on a buggy. And the exceptions to following the Bentley manual will be if you've had a custom engine built and they've used different push rods than the factory, or they have a different setup than factory, then you may have a custom valve clearance. But if your car is basically, an original Volkswagen setup, follow the Bentley manual. Now, I've checked this already on cylinder number 1, and I found that it was tighter than 6/1000ths. Now, I know, because I've done the valve adjustment on this many times, that this was set at 6. So why did it tighten? Usually what you'll find is over time, you'll need to do your valve adjustments because they will back off and become loose. But in this instance, it got tight. Now what could cause that? I know what caused it on this one is when I did the top end of this engine, I put 87mm slip-ins in because I had access to it at the time. I'm not a big fan of them. But it made this a little bit bigger than a 1641 cc now. And these heads were from a 1300. And what I did was I bored out the heads to accept the larger 1600 size slip-in kit. And I fly cut the heads is basically what that would be called, and bored them out. And the reason for that was I had access to these heads at the time. And these heads had a fresh valve rebuild. They'd never been run, only they were fresh from about 35 years ago. They had sat in storage. And the problem is, when these valves tighten up, it's because when they did the valve job on this many years ago, they didn't use hardened valve seats. And so, without leaded fuel, you will get what they call valve seat recession. This should not be a problem on a factory Volkswagen engine because Volkswagen had hardened seats right from the beginning, and they didn't need to change it over when we got rid of leaded gas, like a lot of other manufacturers. But if your heads were rebuilt at one point from the last 40 or 50 or 60 years, it's possible that whoever did the valve job on it may not have used hardened seats, and you'll see that your valves tighten up. Now, what can you do with that? There's nothing you can do to stop it unless you want to pull the head and have new seats put in, actual hardened seats like the factory ones. That was a calculated choice that I made when I built this engine. mainly because it's going in a woods buggy that gets beat on 24/7 and is never, going to be a show car or a daily driver or anything like that. But if I had a car that I wanted to use as a daily driver, or I really wanted it to be right, I would have replaced the seats at the time. But anyway, that was a little lecture on some of the things that happens with valves. But let's go ahead and let's fix these. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to loosen the nut so that we can make an adjustment. And I just want to have enough. I'm going to back these right off so that I'm free to make my adjustment without the nut bottoming out and stopping it. So, okay, that's loose enough. I've got my feeler gauge set to 6/1000. And what I like to do is, I just like to get that up in there. Some people like the ones with the angles on the ends of the feeler gauges, and any of them will work. But then I'm going to tighten this up. And I want a pretty good drag. I mean, I don't want it to be tight, but I like to have, a nice drag. I don't want this to fall out. If it can hold the feeler gauge there, that's where I like to have it. But it's not dragging so tight that it's hard for me to pull it. And what I will do at that point is I put my screwdriver in to hold the adjuster while I bring the nut back down. And then I put the wrench on like this. And what I'm doing is I'm going to hold pressure against the adjuster. I moved it just a hair so that as I'm tightening, I'm not moving the adjuster with the nut and then therefore increasing the tension on the valve. And I tighten them fairly tight, but I don't go super crazy on them. There is a torque spec in the Bentley manual. And you can see this still has a slight drag, but it doesn't fall out. I'm going to call that one good. That was the intake valve. Now I'm going to do the exhaust valve. Same thing. So I've got this again now where I like it. I'm going to bring the nut, just shoulder it. I'm going to check it. I think that feels good for me. I'm going to pull the feeler gauge out. Okay, we're done with cylinder number 1. Now we got to get to do cylinder number 2, because I don't want to keep bouncing back and forth on each side of the car. And I explained this a little bit in the video on how to find top dead center in cylinder number 1. So go back and watch that if you don't understand this process. But I'm going to show you right now an easy way to do it with a pulley. It's kind of hard to spot it with this exhaust on my buggy, but you can see before I showed you that my timing marks were lined up with the split in the case. So what I do is I go 180 degrees from those timing marks, and you can't see them here because this is the front side of the pulley, but my top of my finger is where they're at. And I go down and I paint or scribe a mark on the bottom that will enable me, as we're going to see here just a second, to know that I'm at cylinder number 2. So I'm going to grab the pulleys and I'm going to turn this counterclockwise, which is the opposite way of the engine running, until I bring that white mark to where the case's halves come together. And this baby's got good compression, I'll tell you that. So now my white mark is lined up with the crankcase halves, where they come together by the fuel pump. So returning back over here, I'm going to test by hand. Okay, the exhaust valve is freely moving and the intake valve is freely moving, which means that the valves are closed on cylinder number 2 and it's at top dead center. You could check also in the distributor it is now moved from the scribed line, which is cylinder number 1, to pointing back here, which on the cap, if you had the cap set on here, you could follow that wire and find that it goes to cylinder number 2. For fun, let's see if cylinder number 2 also shows any signs of valve recession. Actually, no. Cylinder number 2 didn't tighten on the intake valve. Let's check the exhaust. It's a little bit more drag than I would want, but it's not bad. I'm going to call that good. I'm not going to adjust these because they're fine. If yours have loosened up or tightened up, do the same process we just saw on cylinder number 1. Let me show you how to find cylinders number 3 and 4, and then we'll cut this video short because you don't need to see the same thing over and over again. So I'm back here facing the engine. This will be the rear of the car, and you can see that my paint mark was lined up with where the case halves come together, and we just checked cylinder number 2. And now what we're going to do is we're going to come back here, do cylinder number 3 and cylinder number 4. And what I'm going to do to get to cylinder number 3 is the same thing we did to get from 1 to 2, except this time I'm not going to bring the paint mark up to the top. I'm going to go back under here, and I'm going to find those timing marks. You can see them right there. I'm going to bring the timing marks back up to the top. The timing marks are now at the split in the case. The rotor is now pointing to the plug wire that would be going to cylinder number 3. And just to double, triple check, I've got play on both valves for cylinder number 3, so I know that it's there. Those valves are closed. Now let's just check, because the exhaust valve on cylinder number 3 feels like it's got a ton of play. Let's see if it really does. I'm going to try to fit an 8 in there. I can almost slide an 8/1000 feeler gauge in there. Okay, I'm going to say it's a very tight 7/1000, so I'm going to adjust this one. Now, I want to check. Now, this one's tightened up, showing signs of recession again. Okay, so 3 is done. Now we're going to go to 4. Same thing, only this time we're going to bring the white dot up to the top for the last time. I've brought my white mark up, and we're ready to do the last one. Okay, so we can check, and these do have some play in them. We know that we're at cylinder 4. But again, I'm feeling both of these are very tight. They're probably a loose 5 or just too tight of a 6. And we're going to correct that. The reason you don't want to run them too tight is the valve needs to completely come back to the head, because that's how the valve cools. It transfers the heat onto the aluminum magnesium head, and the valve gets cooling that way. If it's too tight, the valve's never seating long enough, and it will burn the valve. Okay, the process is done. I'm gonna pop the valve covers on and we'll be all finished. So I hope this video helped you on the valve adjustment. I hope it makes sense. I'm gonna go ahead and get some things back together on this engine, and then we're gonna do a video on a compression test.